The description that I wrote in anticipation for today was, the ability to connect in a media-based, networked age gives artists new reasons to blur, accentuate, or erase the line between the actual and the virtual. Choosing one method over another becomes an aesthetic choice with political implications. Using art historical examples to provide context, this conversation will reconsider the often polarizing discourses routinely associated with handmade materials in an information age. So we'll get to see if that still holds true.
Good afternoon. It's very nice to be here. I like the intimate environment, so this is a very nice place to share about craft, which is typically thought of as more of an intimate medium. So I want to thank the SBA Critical Writing Program and the conference organizer. So this is an abbreviated version of my paper. So I just want to begin by telling you why I wanted to write this paper. I saw an article in the New York Times back in May 2nd. It was on the front page. It was entitled, "For Craftsmen, a Fragile Lifeline from Craigslist." And the author wrote about home construction workers who use Craigslist to line up work. Well, a construction worker, a day laborer, didn't correspond to my image of a craftsman who worked in the studio using a traditional art material, or traditional craft material like wood, fiber, metal, or glass, or clay. So I imagine William Safire rolling over in his grave, giving an apparent blatant misuse of the term craftsman on the front page of the New York Times. But then I had to examine my assumptions. Why not? Why not use that word craftsman? After all, the American Crafts Museum changed its name to the Museum of Arts and Design, based on the argument that distinctions that define craft have become blurred. Still, would the museum's board of directors call it the Museum of Blurred Distinctions? Oh. So my motor was revved up. I was ready to launch a crusade and to restore the term craft to the name of that beloved institution formerly known as the American Crafts Museum. It seems that we lost something. And if we did that, people would know when they saw craft and might consider using the term craft and craftsman more carefully. However, I realized this was based on my assumption and my understandings of craftspersons as makers in craft studios. So I had to step back and say, well, what am I thinking? Why am I looking at it this way? And then I looked at my own experience. I am a ceramic artist. I'm equally comfortable working. I do pottery. I'm a clay person. I make pots. So I come from a clay background, and in that clay tradition, I think clay artists struggle with their identity as both craftspeople and as artists. I feel that I sort of balance both realms and see myself as both. So this paper then is examining this issue of craft as it has dissolved craft and clay in a way that is dissolved into the world of art. So I'm going to give you a short, brief history about American ceramics and hopefully put that in the context of the American art. So here we have, I'm just going to read from here now. The American art pottery movement, which began in the late 1800s, was an outgrowth and expression of the American arts and crafts movement. The American arts and crafts movement itself was an offspring of the British arts and crafts movement led by John Ruskin and William Morris. Influential women ceramic artists of the art pottery movement included Adelaide Asa-Robinot and Maria Longworth Nichols. Their work was influenced by European models and fine porcelainware of China and Japan. Their work, as you see here, tends to be highly resolved and fairly ornate and intricately decorated. Their inventiveness and originality, however, was expressed through the designs of their vessels and their glazing. The same artist did this one. Is that? So there's a little different concern there for form and surface. The titles of those pieces were the Aladdin Vase and Scare Vase. So these women, craft artists, made global art historical and literary references in the craft world. However, these highly stylized and tightly controlled aesthetics of the art pottery movement were shaken loose by Japanese Zen aesthetics, popularized by Shoji Hamada, his work is on the left, and Bernard Leach during their national tours and workshops of the 1950s. They championed a craftsman creed of truth to materials and embraced the accidental and spontaneous. The work of Bernard Leach and Shoji Hamada, based on the Japanese Menge folk art movement, introduced wood firing and a subdued earth tone palette to American audience in the ceramic world. This earthy aesthetic of wabi-sabi, or elegant simplicity, continues to influence a wide range of functional pottery produced in Australia, England, and America today. A leading figure of this continued legacy is noted Minnesota potter Warren McKenzie, whose work is on the right. I like Warren. There's Warren, and who's he next to? Franz Klein, circa 1952. I think there's some dialogue going on there. After World War II, that's more of Warren McKenzie's work. He's still alive. He's making pots in his 90s, so he's slowed down a bit, but he's a really remarkable man. After World War II, there was a concurrent transition regarding not only in the clay work itself, the type of work that was going on in the States. There was a huge explosion. There was a big transition in where teaching and learning of ceramics took place. Teaching and learning in ceramics moved from professional ceramic studios and pottery production factories into college and university studio art departments. This, to me, contributed to watershed developments in ceramics during the late 1950s and early 60s, which has been termed the clay revolution.
I'm still perplexed about this thing called art and why it even exists and what sort of function it serves in our everyday lives. These words spoken by contemporary artist and designer Andrea Zittel resonates with me today just as it did the first time I recited them years ago. Her questioning of the functionality of art and its service to our everyday diverged into my personal observations regarding the imbalance of language and skilled craft in contemporary art. Plagued with uncertainty concerning the state of artistic practices and the schools that educate our contemporary artists, I began to ask, does the sudden burst of inspiration negate the necessity of skill? What are the individual roles of language and material in crafting contemporary practice, and how, if at all anymore, are they interdependent? Questions such as these weighed heavily on my mind as the unequivocal balance of language and skilled craft in contemporary arts practice was unveiled to me. While the drive to produce a purity of art form still exists, the materiality and framing of art has progressed in a way that no longer weighs these two constituents equally. Rather, in art we have entered the juncture of the post-medium, a suspension or paralyzed stasis of a society de-skilled in its material craft practices. By this I mean simply the ways in which we talk about art, such as Duchamp's fountain, and our reliance on theoretical language to bring meaning to the work, now outweighs the importance of materiality. It is as if the crafting of material has fallen second to the crafting of language. This sentiment reflects what I observe in current contemporary arts practice. The overabundance of language as frame for art has compromised material competence, illustrating a moment where the contemporary artist's hand and head are divided. My research project, Labors of Language, Crafting the Revival of Medium in Contemporary Art, argues for the reclaiming of artistic authorship through the routine praxis of craft labor as defined by scholar C. Wright Mills. Defined as a labor with a sense of craft that becomes engaged in the work in and for itself, the balance of daily labors and the discourse generated by such work are connected to an artisan's mind. Skill develops within the process and is connected to the freedom to experiment and develop community. My research presents two discursive case studies, one in educational pedagogy from Deep Springs College, the other a close reading of contemporary artist Andrea Zittel's Functional Living Spaces, reminiscent of Bauhaus principles. These studies illustrate ways in which their individual adaptations of craft labor might best begin the reclamation of material artistic authorship by approaching them from the dilemma from an educational and artistic practice perspective. I offer these case studies as propositions or suggestions how to best reclaim the imbalance of language and skilled craft within contemporary art by pulling characteristics from each model. Keep in mind, it's not my aim to provide a singular solution for the imbalance of language over labor within current art production, but rather think about how best to reapproach a reclamation of the situation from a multitude of examples taken from my case studies. According to writer Howard Singerman, the problem with defining what it means to be an artist today pertains to the fact that crafting practices of a particular media are no longer viable. Sculptors do not technically need to know how to sculpt, and painters need not paint. The shifted importance of skilled craft in an artwork to the language that frames the artwork has brought us to art's post-medium age. Artists at present are expected to possess a sense of autonomous governorship over their work, but how can such autonomy and responsibility can be taught? How can such an artist be trained? When I started thinking about my research project, I was realizing that I was describing it to myself as almost like a doctor and diagnosing a patient. So I was observing these symptoms in my MA program of training contemporary artists, and I was seeing, okay, what's this dilemma, what's this problem? And the diagnosis that I came to was we needed a return to this balance of physical labor, but also the balance of language. And without this balance, the art wasn't, really matching up in my eyes. So my sites of rehabilitation come in my case studies at Deep Springs and Andrea's Attell. So as I stated, I observed Deep Springs College as a site of rehabilitation. It's an all-male liberal arts college located on an alfalfa farm and a cattle ranch in California's high desert. It's unlike anything I've ever come across. Imagine being 18 years old, about to embark on your college experience, and you arrive on campus and see this. Or this. You're greeted with a wide open desert, a ranch, and a farm. Your roommates don't sleep in on the weekends or eat your supply of ramen noodles. Instead, they gather on a porch and discuss Heidegger and debate art. And your dorm isn't necessarily a dorm room at all. Instead, your collegiate experience is driven by a labor program designed to utilize work and process as both a unifier and method in the building of self-governance and community. Founded in 1917 by electrical pioneer L.L. Nunn, the school operates on the belief that manual labor is an integral part of the comprehensive art education. The pedagogy at Deep Springs is a method of reinforcing the importance of autonomy through an effective craft labor program. Blending the intrinsic ethics of work and play, Deep Springs is a place where authorship meets self-cultivation in hopes that art will meet life through a praxis of craft labor ritual. Struggling to reflect the desires for community engagement, responsibility through self-discipline, and the balance of theoretical language and creative pursuits, arts institution nowadays must try and negotiate how fulfilling all of these needs are possible. Deep Springs' progressive curriculum is a means of successfully, although I admit unconventionally, addressing all of these issues currently plaguing contemporary arts education. It seeks to align both the practical exploration of material with theory and language in an everyday praxis. Although Deep Springs is not an art institution, their curriculum proposes many of the objectives that would serve useful for contemporary art schools. Their founding three principles of manual labor, academics, and self-governance aims to foster an understanding of autonomous governorship through education and communal responsibility. This is currently lacking in art institutions. Throughout the two-year program, students reside in complete isolation and routinely engage in ranching, farm chores, and communal cooking while balancing their academic explorations. During their stay on the ranch, participants engage in a minimum of a 20-hour work week on top of their grueling academic studies. Possible labors, as I said, include communal cooking to delivering calves on farm. Although these examples of farm operations are unconventional modes of artistic practice, I do support the notion that they are a form of craft labor applicable to an artist's training. The daily regimen of work, self-reflection, and academic freedom allows students to achieve authorship over their time spent on the ranch. The critical aspect of understanding the Deep Springs labor curriculum and perceiving it as more than physical activity required at an alternative school is its method of practicing the necessity of a skilled craft and the benefits of a well-balanced lifestyle.
Since the advent of industrialized mass production in the 19th century, the appeal importance of craft commodities most often results from the explicit focus on the individual labor involved in creation. Leaders of the arts and crafts movement of the late 19th century, like William Morris, considered craft to be an antidote to mass production. Morris asserted in his 1892 preface to John Ruskin's The Nature of the Gothic, for, quote, "As strange as it may seem to us today, there have been times when man did rejoice in his work."
Heavily influenced by Ruskin, Morris believed medieval workmen were artists whose art was the expression of man's pleasure in labor. That's where the title of my talk came from. Okay. This situation began to change in the 16th century, creating a division of labor between workmen and artists. By the late 19th century, Morris felt that workmen were reduced to slaves of machines. In order to combat this problem, Morris and other leaders of the arts and crafts movement tried to revive the traditions of the past and recreate the social relations of artisan guilds. And that's just an example from one of them. These new guilds provided leaders of the arts and craft movement with more than just the labor necessary to produce art and craft objects. They also served as a way to address social concerns about the alienating effects of industrial mass production. The arts and crafts movement was motivated by three principal ideas, according to historian Alan Crawford. The first is the unity of art, which is artists and craftsmen working together. Kind of a theme of this panel, I'd say. The second is joy in labor, the creative satisfaction of ordinary work. And the third is design reform, or making manufactured objects better. If workers were in charge of the whole process of design and creation, they would find a satisfaction in their labor that they could never find in just part of the process. Where leaders of the arts and crafts movement dreamed of using craft as part of a socialist future, contemporary craftspeople, in this case I'm mostly talking about amateur craftspeople, including those running the website Etsy, think of craft as part of a sustainable future. A future where craft can be an antidote to the, quote, eviscerated, simulated screen experiences we consume for hours each day. Craft commodities work, according to anthropologist Susan Theriault, by making visible certain forms of production and their social relations. Craft commodities are, quote, the bearers of the social identities of their makers, and for this reason retain certain inalienable properties. Produced in limited quantities, using traditional methods and or materials, they invoke uninterrupted continuity with the past. The appeal and importance of craft commodities results from the explicit focus on the individual labor involved in creation. As metalsmith Gabriel Craig argues, craft reminds us how to manufacture at a human scale. In this way, craft relates to ethical consumption movements such as those for fair trade and sustainability and against sweatshops. Additionally, shop local movements want consumers to recognize the importances of small businesses for job creation in their local economies. This fits well with the individual craftsperson or small workshop mode of creation seen in the sort of contemporary, amateur craft movement. According to some theorists, ethical consumption can reinvent political participation and civic activism. Yet, other theorists express concerns with ethical consumption movements and worry that they are limited to affluent consumers or lead to a fetishized defetishization of the commodity form. So this would reinforce current labor conditions rather than leading to systemic changes. So first I'll talk about how people do talk about craft, then I'll focus on Etsy some more, and finally how these sort of labor and ethical consumption movements are related. The contemporary interest in craft and craftsmanship can be seen in a variety of ways. In the last 5 to 10 years, the number of craft shows has multiplied. The Magazine Publishers of America lists around 300 magazines devoted to craft, hobbies, and knitting. A number of websites devoted to selling handmade goods have been created, including Etsy, Artfire, and Zibbit. Countless blogs and online video tutorials explain craft techniques and share DIY tips. Additionally, large American companies like Jeep and New Balance specifically advertise the craftsmanship involved in their products. Craftsmanship, according to New York Times writer, has been considered a, quote, vital ingredient of the American self-image as a can-do, inventive, we-can-make-anything people, end quote. While some lament the decline of craftsmanship as part of the reduction of manufacturing and vocational training, others respond that craftsmanship and creativity have not declined, just the outlet for it has changed. So today, many definitions of craft exist. For art historian Howard Rosati, craft is a fundamental expression of human values and human achievement, part nature, part culture, and separate from fine art and design. Anna Farello speaks of an essence of craft bound to the hand, to the process of working and making. Curator Janice Jeffries claims that to craft is to care. For glass artist Che Rhodes, craft connects the past with the future. For scholar Dennis Stevens, craft becomes linked with more genuine and authentic forms of human production. Craft therefore becomes a form of social dissent by focusing on the activity of making, on the labor itself, rather than on the end product. So the reasons for some of these pictures was sort of the focus. These are from Etsy's website, Etsy's blog, of on the hands and sort of the asking specifically what handmade means to the craftspeople they're featuring. So most definitions of craft involve the concepts of making by hand and connecting with tradition. And as I said, so the focus on handmaking is used to make explicit the labor involved in individually producing objects as opposed to the division of labor involved in mass producing objects.
everybody. How are you? My name is Petya Trepcheva-Kwon, and I'm very pleased to be here this afternoon. I'm very glad to be able to present my thesis research paper that is called The Symbiosis of Traditional and Digital Techniques. I'm really passionate about this topic for two reasons. Once, I'm a fine artist whose background is both in traditional fine art and computer art techniques. And the other reason is because I find that the art form that combines traditional and digital techniques is very unique, very special, and it's a merging point between the digital and the pre-digital era, and a form of symbiosis that should have a significant placement in art history. I think it's surprising that even today, art forms are often seen as either traditional or digital, and intense discussions over the value and potential of one technological approach over the other take place. Such separation between art forms is unnatural and limiting, and with my essay, I investigate the important role of art expression cultivated by merging and explore the workflows of different generations of artists, William Kentridge, Shaza Sikander, and Nina Pali. These three artists combine traditional drawing and painting techniques with computer animation programs. And indeed, their artwork cannot exist if only traditional or only digital techniques were used. So I have prepared a short movie. William Kentridge has a now signature technique. He photographs his charcoal drawings over time, recording scenes as they evolve. He draws, erases, and redraws, photographing each step of the process, animating an entire film on a single sheet of paper. Every movement leaves behind faded traces, making the process a visible part of the work itself. A single drawing is altered and photographed in this manner until the end of the scene. This way, Kentridge's films come to preserve the traces of the previous drawings, creating the scene of fading memories and time passing. The sheet of paper that he draws on is attached on the wall, and halfway across the studio is his camera. He alters his drawings and walks back to the camera to take 2 shots and then walks back to the drawing to continue with the modifications. If the scene is 100 frames long, Kendrick walks back and forth 50 times. Often each scene is altered hundreds of times. The artist says that is during this physical walk between the camera and the drawing that the new images and ideas suggest themselves.
I see a couple sort of patterns in what we heard from all of you, which was also different, but at the same time, I see how craft techniques are becoming digitized, or not becoming, or they have become digitized, or more performative, and there is in it, we are finding an opportunity to be social, and we're finding a certain autonomy in that. And I saw that sort of running through all of your pieces. And particularly of interest was this relationship to time that I saw in all of your pieces in very different ways, relationships to time. So I don't know if you guys have any commentary on that. Yeah.
I just pick up a strand from your theme on like the notion of the utopian idealism associated with craft. There's a huge long history of this utopian notion. Is more European than American, but the sense that art and craft somehow are connected to some social good.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the Steinway Piano Factory in Queens, Steinway built schools, libraries, hospitals for the people working there. In China today, you'll have corporate campuses where they buy 50 acres and they bring in consultants, and they're employing 5,000 people with homes, hospitals, healthcare, schools, and this is 2010, so or 12, whatever. It's just this whole notion of a decade, a century later, that there's still this quest economically and personally. How do you create some sort of harmony in the world?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Certainly.
That's the time thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Your commentary on time, Michelle, was interesting about talking about leisure with Etsy, and I was wondering if you wanted to talk about it a little more.
It seems the more I sort of took out a longer section on leisure, because it seems that when more and more people are thinking about leisure, it's really the intent. What makes something work versus leisure is really the intent behind it. So even if it's something as structured and repetitious that you would hate to do as a job, if you choose to do it, I guess if it's a matter of choice, and then that you find fun in something that you get to choose to do. And I think actually sort of the enjoyment of the process is also maybe another theme that came across, particularly in yours. I think the kind of looking at craft labor, it wasn't necessarily fun, but a different way of looking at to choosing. I guess it comes back to, again, to choice, to in all of the choice of the process and the method maybe, and then to find that enjoyable and fun. And yes, time consuming, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
It is definitely a more time intensive process.
In terms of time, in connection to the projects that I presented, obviously time is an issue when you have animation piece, you have a timeline, you have a story to tell. That's on one side, and on the other side, while the images are being created physically, obviously that requires a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of labor and patience. That is what is so humbling to all those artists, all this just effort that goes into it, and it is meditative to the artist in a way, and healing as well. Time is definitely something that brings artists close to their subjects. The more time they spend painting something, like the way Kendrick says, the closer I become, the better I understand what I'm trying to express.
Mm-hmm.
So that is definitely important.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it seems a lot of you talk about the value of labor in itself, but the question is, where does the aesthetics, where does the material? There's a lot of issues that come up in all of your talks about utopianism versus materiality versus, I think in your talk I was sort of struck by the fact where is this work being displayed? Like Kentridge is very much part of a fine arts context.
All of them are really fine artists.
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference in terms of where certain art is displayed. You know, Zittel also is really shown in museums and is considered fine arts, whereas a lot of what you're talking about in terms of crafts, and I know the Museum of Arts and Design changed their name from crafts because they feel it's devalued, which I always thought was a very strange move. But there is a sense in the art world, I think, that crafts is kind of marginalized. And I think what you were talking about was very interesting about the clay people who are trying to make clay into a fine arts product or a fine arts context, you know, take the clay out of the pot context. And, you know, because I've seen now a lot of shows recently in the galleries of people working with clay and making vessels, but it's now become more accepted as Ken Price is certainly the most well-known. But there's a lot of dichotomies in terms of, you know, what is considered, what is sold in a gallery, what is sold on Etsy, what's sold on eBay,
Right.
you know, where is it shown? And I think in each of your talks, it would be interesting to, if you could talk a little about that.
I was curious on the nature of the work that's created in the college. I mean, you didn't show us
Right.
any of their
Mhm.
projects, and so I'm wondering, you know, are they reflective of this labored curriculum that they have? That's a very hands-on manual or working curriculum that you
Yeah.
described.
The process of doing the research for Deep Springs was really interesting. I tried to go to campus and visit with them, but it was a very political implication. They had to vote, and it needed to be unanimous that a woman especially would be allowed on campus. And so I was rejected, and I couldn't go. But I got to conduct a lot of great email interviews and phone interviews with the president of the school. And all of the students said that predominantly, I think it was the statistic was 80 or 90% didn't come into the college with the intent to become an artist, but being there and being on this ranch, they all had a philosophical background or were interested in mathematics, but they really wanted to channel this also deep-rooted physicality that they had. So they would be in the fields, delivering calves and cooking in a kitchen, but then they would spend their spare time at a pottery wheel or painting or reading about videos and new media arts. And so nothing was really clumped into one genre of this class was geared towards painting. I was more interested in, they pretty much all said that as they were working throughout the day is when they were cultivating the ideas for what they would do in their spare time. And so that link of labor into what they were doing artistically was just very insightful to me and interesting. So.
And what degree do they get?
It's a 2-year program. They receive a bachelor's degree, but I think it's 97% go on to Ivy League colleges, and then they'll start as a junior and graduate. There's a lot of CEOs also involved too that arts are in their spare time, but I was fascinated. It
So
was
in
a cool
terms of
idea.
how they see the arts education, I mean, how do they perceive this then as not necessarily creating artists, they also see it as creating a certain way of thinking
Mhm.
that is then people who are going into other fields,
Right.
Besides the visual arts or
Yeah.
the tactile.
And I loved it because so many of the students kept stressing the word balance, and they kept feeling well, if I was at a college campus and I was an athlete, then I wouldn't have time to take arts, or I wouldn't have time to do these other things. But the fact that they give them these freedoms to, you're required to work 20 hours a week, you're required to take your coursework. Now what you do in the remaining hours of your time is completely up to you. And so many of them identified that the visual arts, the performing arts, was lacking in their day-to-day activity. So they would form these things, I think it was bi-weekly. They would come and they would put on just impromptu plays or performance art pieces. So they all identified that component was sort of missing in their lives, and carried with them throughout. I talked to graduates as well, so.
That partying.
What about alcohol on this campus? I mean, is this, it's very
No alcohol.
okay.
No alcohol, no TV.
What was the rationale for just an all-male campus as opposed to opening it, even for allowing a female visitor to come in? And is there a female manifestation of something similar to what you saw at Deep Springs?
I couldn't find an example of a female college. I searched, I tried. The gender politics involved almost took my project in a whole new direction. I almost wanted to spend all of my time researching the school and why it was male versus female. They operate under a very democratic system. So there have been plenty of students that have said, we need females here. We need to open this up to women and let them encounter the things of the physical things that we're doing, the intellectual things that we're doing. But every time they vote for 20 plus years, it always goes to remain male. So.
And that brings up an interesting question in terms of Etsy, because Etsy is predominantly female, is that
Right.
correct?
Right.
So, yeah, so.
Yeah.
Maybe you could just comment on that.
Yeah.
Oh, I would say
No,
it seems
one
like a lot of what Etsy, the biggest categories I think are jewelry and knitting, which are not particularly, I guess the knitting and jewelry not necessarily just female, but come out of this sort of domestic crafts that then people get better at or try to make businesses out of. So I think yes, it's Etsy's, where it's drawing from is a kind of domestic female craft trajectory, although it was initially started by men, and I think they're not quite sure what happened, maybe, I don't know.
They constructed it for women only.
Yeah, but I would also say I think a lot of the sellers, previous statistics I had also indicated that a lot of them were married women with children who then also had the time in which to do this sort of while perhaps staying at home and taking care of their children and running a business at the same time, so that's kind of their clientele.
They take a percentage? I mean, how do the Etsy people make a living on?
Yes, they for every listing, they charge 20 cents, and then you can also buy some advertisements on the website, and then and up per sale there's a percentage per sale. So yeah, there's listing fee and a percentage when people sell their items. So that's where but there's no outside advertisement on the site, unlike some of the other craft sites have. Like are sponsored by Michael's or Joann's or something.
Okay, in the back.
Thank you guys so much. I guess since craft is so intrinsically connected to labor, I was curious how these trajectories within the medium, these historical trajectories, are they responding to economic kind of like a movement from a product-based to a service-based economy in the United States? And if so, it's interesting that some of these trajectories are suggesting this like bucolic return to like an isolated privilege, sort of an emphasis on individual authorship, or like this like democratized like commodification of craft, versus what the first individual spoke about is this more social practice minded, utilizing the medium to go beyond a commodified object. I'm guessing, so that's sort of a large question. Just are these trajectories informed by these economic movements within the West? And if so, it's interesting that they're moving in very private sectors and very collectivist sectors. And is there a discussion within the craft world about that?
Well, I want to tie in a couple of thoughts. One is this notion of dichotomy. I think maybe there's that mistaken notion that craft in and of itself doesn't make a statement, but I think that's implicit in the work that we hear, that when people make a choice to create work, even if they're marketing or selling Etsy or wherever, that is a statement of itself. So that's one consideration. The other is, I think in Europe there's a lot of government support for some of the social practice initiative, and it's getting a lot of, and so that in the American counterpart, I'm imagining as the programs get established in institutions of higher learning, oh, now we have an MFA program in social practice, you get an endowed chair, you get faculty, you get students sort of drawn to that notion. But that also speaks to, I think, a growing emerging trend for community-based arts and just a widening of where, where is art taking place, how, and for whom. So it's just part of a larger, I think the talks about revolution earlier this afternoon were speaking about just a more presence of multiple voices. And so I think that's the larger global trend. People are finding a voice in a variety of ways and contexts.
Yeah, I believe that in the end it doesn't matter what tool set you use to express your ideas. In the end, what the most important thing is the content. And yeah, it doesn't matter if a project is done just with traditional techniques, with physical labor, or with all on a computer. However, I do find that the merging of both is extremely interesting and unique. But in the end, what the tool set is, it doesn't matter. It's the content that's most important, the message.
You guys want to comment?
I would also say from the outside, it looks extremely utopian, which I think I was very drawn to initially. But the more you dig deeper into the college specifically, as I've said, you find that it's not as democratic as they want to market it, because they're still remaining in this extremely isolated bubble. Mail doesn't come for like a week after it would the nearest town. There's no TV, there's no alcohol, there's no female. So
It's like ashram in India.
you're
Is there internet? Pottery. I mean, do they have internet? Do they have any kind of connection outside of this kind of craft, more labor-oriented activity?
I would assume not.
But you had email with them, right?
Well, it was staff
Uh-huh.
members. They would obviously relay messages to students. My direct email was with graduates who were in other institutions like Brown or Yale with internet access. In terms of Andrea Zettel's work, the byproduct, as I said in my presentation, is a sense of community and like really working together, and you're in these travel units and you're sharing this communal meal or whatever. But in reality, how many people can afford one of those things? So then you want to look online. There's people that have bought them that will sell you the manuals of how to build your own, or how to make your own travel escape pod. So there's that. But
I have a question about accessibility and thinking about the demographic, the higher prevalence of women on Etsy compared to men. This idea of the accessibility of crafting compared to maybe more fine arts, and if you have any thoughts about the potential empowerment of crafting, that I hear everyone kind of saying, like you're able to kind of utilize your voice. In a way, I wonder if that you have any thoughts about the gender difference with regard to that.
Gender is something that, yes, I think I need to focus on more, but I would say that there is sort of also a history of women, particularly in the 70s, of using craft as empowerment, women taking, and I think this partially kind of ties back into craft and art, sort of using craft, sort of traditional women undervalued techniques, and kind of to push it into the art world to gain greater respect for sort of traditional women's work and women's creative practices. So I don't know any sort of specific things to say, but I do think it is important. It is a good source. In particular, I guess I'm looking at things that are there for sale. It's a good source of income and independence, and it's a way that fits well within, I guess, it's a flexible way to work that can definitely be helpful, and I am not trying to say otherwise. Yeah.
Well, except for the fact that you said out of 800,000 people, 200.
It's not necessarily the only number of people.
Yeah, but
that
I actually do believe this, and what ran through my head as you said this is that, I grew up as a crafty person. I made tie-dye and candles and all this stuff, and I realized at the age of 14 or 15 when I tried to sell some stuff at a consignment shop that this was no way to make a living, that you really could not make a living this way. And yes, it sort of supplemented my babysitting money, but that was really about it. And I think that's part of why, and I think it's fantastic that Etsy exists and all these women are doing this. But it is basically supplemental. It really doesn't pay for life in New York City, despite the New York Times article just last week about this. So I think it's sort of, this probably ties into the voice question, that it's more for satisfaction and, personal need for operating in the material world, which we also heard about in the panel on moving images earlier today. But I do think as so much of our life becomes disembodied, that the craving for embodiment is getting stronger, regardless of the financial return. I mean,
Everything is
Nina Paley did
digitalized.
not make any money on Citizens of Blue. I can tell you that much, so.
Yeah, well, she didn't, but it's true. It's everything around us is digitalized, everything, and at the same time we continue to live in the material world. So this is a challenge in a way. An animation, for example, on the monitor, you don't have electricity and it disappears all of a sudden. It's very ephemeral art, but it is part of the contemporary art, and it's just how it is. We are challenged between the material world and the digital world. We are kind of used to having the ability to see things fast, to edit them fast, to undo them, but at the same time, when you have to do things manually, all of a sudden you cannot do that, and there's where the patience is required and the love for labor in order to achieve.
And somebody like, it's also interesting to note that somebody like Kentridge will sell the drawings to the pieces for a lot of things. So, I mean, there are ways to monetize the craft aspect. And, also Andrea Zettel's work, those will sell for fine arts type money. And some of the crafts people's work, once it's considered in a different context, will also sell for a fair amount of money. So there's a lot of layers to the to this market, and how, Etsy might not be the top, and, but then there are ways to monetize this, and then there's ways to not monetize it. The more utopian impulse, which I think continues to this day, and I think that's a very important part of everybody's talk here, was bringing out the utopian impulse behind the crafts movement. That still goes back to William Morris and even further back, and it's still part of today's crafts community. So.
And just that we're going back to these things to be social or have some type of autonomous sort of authorship on these objects says something about the time we're in, because it is becoming fetishized, where people are finding like novelty in craft, and for new reasons now, reasons that were different from the past. So this defetishization of commodity goods in anti-consumer neoliberal, but that's interesting, because there is a certain insularity that crops up where it's, sort of fetishized, but also it has some sort of resurgence that becomes interesting. And I was wondering, like, at the end you say, it could be a part of larger structural changes. What did you mean by that?
I think it's the same with the fair trade and the sort of sustainable movements and so on, is that by drawing attention to problems that exist, it will lead to bigger like craft itself is not, as particularly you were saying, it's not a sustainable or not an economically feasible way for everyone to make everything or buy everything handmade. It's very expensive and time consuming and so on and so forth. But I do think drawing things that draw attention to problems in particularly labor and inequalities around the world, sweatshops and so on and so forth are helpful and are good ways forward to say, hey, there's a problem, here's one way of fixing it, even if it's not the end result. It kind of helps, I guess, is what I meant.
I think that in the end, it's not the final product that is the most important. It's more the process.
Yeah.
Just like Truby was saying, it's they enjoy doing those crafts, right? They enjoy being engaged with that labor, and it's more about the process. The same way that, you know, Kentridge, for example, said, it's more about the process.
Yeah.
And Shaw's secondary than the end result.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Occupy Handmade.
Well, Occupy is interesting actually because it was a true symbiosis of traditional and digital techniques where they were hand making the signage for it, but there were also like meetups on the internet where people were getting together. So it was a great mixture of handmade in the information age there. I don't know if you guys have any commentary on that. We're kind of
I would say if you want to
Wrap it up.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
great, and then we can all move towards the end.
Sure, sure. We're going to head over to the SVA Theater. There's a lecture by Claire Bishop, and you all should definitely come and see it. But did anybody have any last minute questions? Thank you.